Alrighty, welcome back to the Information Revolution. It's a podcast for people working with information. And let's do the names as we do. So my name's Michael Upton. I'm an information management consultant. I work for a little company in New Zealand called Metataxis, New Zealand.
And I'm Judi Vernau. I'm an information architect. I'm also in New Zealand and work for that little company, Metataxis.
And I'm Karl Melrose. I work for Castlepoint Systems in Canberra. My views are my own. Big disclaimer there. Little disclaimer, big disclaimer. We'll see.
It's feral we're going. So today we're going to kind of extend on what we've been talking about in the last couple of episodes. So if you haven't checked those out, you might want to listen to those. We talked about the EDRMS 2 episodes ago, and basically failure of the EDRMS. Like, why isn't EDRMS working as a concept, or why hasn't it worked? And then last time we were talking about Microsoft 365. So thankfully, we got a bunch of comments and interest around those topics, which I think is really good news because I think they are important in terms of particularly government information management. And I thought maybe we could open up. Judi, you had something interesting that you heard back.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I was talking to someone in Wellington recently who said, and they have this organization that has SharePoint and an EDRMS. And I was just asking her why they didn't just move entirely to SharePoint since everybody seems to work in there. And as an information architect, I don't necessarily understand all the details of the Public Records Act here. She said, no, we can't do that because it's not compliant with New Zealand legislation. So then I thought, well, I'll ask my colleagues in the UK what they think about this, because I know, or think I know, that most of the work that they do around this kind of thing is in 365, so using SharePoint. And they said, oh, we don't have anybody these days, or we don't know of people who are working with EDRMS as a starting point. They all use SharePoint. Why would you not think of that as a record keeping system? And so I'm thinking, I don't know. As I said, I'm an information architect. I'm not a records person or an archivist. So I thought, well, I'll ask Michael what he thinks about that. So, Michael, why is SharePoint not an EDRMS if you configure it appropriately?
Well, I mean, I would say it is, or it can be an EDRMS.
Yeah, as my colleagues would say, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, of course, I'm aware of Metataxis UK's work, and yeah, I mean, they do a lot of work around records in the UK, and I don't
Absolutely.
understand why. Sorry, and specifically in what is now being called SharePoint. What's it called? Just SharePoint in Microsoft 365. That Microsoft moved away from calling it
SharePoint Online.
Microsoft
I think it's still the
saying
technical
that.
term. Have they?
Yeah, they gave up on that, so now they want us to say something more cumbersome and confusing.
Oh.
Anyway, take it as read that throughout this podcast episode, if I say SharePoint, I mean in Microsoft 365. So, look, I mean, there are compliance gaps, and last episode I tried to quickly summarize what it was that you could still do in terms of managing records. And I mean, there are definitely things that I wish were much easier, but if I mean, the thing I'd fundamentally want to like wind all the way back to actually is that if we are going to obsess over compliance, and we've had episodes where we've tried to say, please don't, please focus on,
Yes.
actually delivering value to an organization through supporting the people who work there. You there's been ISO standards. There's the ICA rec, as they were called, ICA rec modules and things. And how long ago is that? I think it's 10 years ago, that said, here are the requirements for managing records in a line of business system. And so, it's been at least a decade of people trying to formalize a view that must have existed already. So basically what I'm trying to say is it's been absolutely ages that people have been, in a sort of compliance setting, have been pushing for how you could manage records well outside of an EDRMS. So I think, firstly, I'd sort of say there's this kind of wrong-headed focus on, oh, we must have an EDRMS because the EDRMS is essential to compliance. I just don't think, I don't know, I just don't think end users separate their working lives in the way that they would have to for us to succeed with this kind of narrow
Mm.
view of an
Mm.
EDRMS is the thing that drives good record keeping, and good record keeping involves putting something into a particular place.
Let's be. I mean, just to be a little bit of a pedant though, because this is a
Yeah,
compliance.
yeah.
We are talking about
Let's go.
compliance now. I mean, I think we've got to. I think we've got to be really clear. It's not about record keeping. It's about records management.
Yeah, that's the
You know,
point, isn't it? It's
record keeping, as in
Yeah.
deciding what information we're going to record,
yeah.
so that we've got it at some point. Records management. How are we going to manage that information that's been created?
And the disposition side of it. Yeah. That's the
Sorry, good
that's
call.
the issue, isn't it? Yeah, it is a good call, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say is, I mean, like we know that disposal or disposition's not happening in digital. Like we know that it's failed in terms of current processes and systems in that broad sense of the I really liked last time, Karl, you had a focus on social routines. The social routines are not there that would ever allow disposition, at least at scale. And so I kind of just think, well, sorry, I mean, just kind of drifting a bit from the actual
No, but this is
starting
good.
point.
I think we're getting on to the meat of some really important stuff. I mean, I think
Yeah,
the underlying problem for disposition is that in most cases, disposition's a $10 solution to a 10-cent problem.
100%. Well, that's a bunch of different numbers there, but yes, yeah, and
Whatever your numbers are. I mean,
absolutely, it's absolute overkill to to think that you ought to be investing in sort of come on, brain, like if you were in a situation where you thought, oh, okay, we can't fully work with SharePoint because of compliance, and that's the only reason that we would look at another solution. The idea that that other solution ought to be full-blown EDRMS just seems nuts to me. Like to your point, Karl, like in terms of the kind of spend versus the value returned, like that just seems silly. Um, if it even works, and I also just don't think it works. So I just think the combination of those things just makes it ridiculous. So to be
So
specific about that, I just don't think that you would get an outcome where you were managing the most valuable information to a better standard because you purchased an EDRMS or maintained an EDRMS just to look after disposal. You know,
that's
I think that is,
really interesting.
but
Really
I think
interesting
that's the
point.
big point. Has EDRMS and I don't know whether we really articulated it quite so clearly in the first episode. Has Is there a functional relationship between deploying an EDRMS in your organization and then having better standards of records? Better records coming out the other end, so that
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
reuse the information. Faster, better, cheaper business processes, all those kinds of things. And I think we could argue that pretty convincingly that the answer is no. And I think we have EDRMS as the standards systems that comply with them, process. I think it's quite a circular sort of thing. And I think, you look at when the big records management systems, really started, it was 1984, 1985, sort of those early, that was really when EDRMS came about. And what I'd be really interested to understand, and we could actually ask David Muldrich, because I think he was he was the guy who actually wrote what became ISO 15489, or at least convened the group that for, I guess it was Australian standards at that point, that actually ended up writing that standard. How did they go about writing the standard? Was it looking at the capability that was available and then aiming to codify
what was good
some of
about it?
that stuff into a standard to say, look, so it was that sort of, we need a standard here, we need a best practice. And so I'm going to go and look at what these records, what these things that are calling themselves records management systems and electronic records management systems, I'm going to go at what they and look at what they deliver, and then look at what, the principles of records management, and, then write a standard based on what seems to be sensible and pragmatic, and, a bar that we should all aim to jump over if we can. Or I don't even know where I feel like I'm rambling into space now. There's a point here that I'm trying to, I feel
I
like it's
think
important, it's that what created the systems and the standards, was
sure.
it that's what I'm really trying to get at. Where did they come from? Did the EDRMS category exist because the standards created it, or did we have the technology and then we created a standard that matched the technology that we had? And I'm not sure,
I actually think
was there a, go on?
I actually think where you're going is very similar to the amazing analogy you told back in a few episodes back to do with tying a cat to a tree, where
Oh,
there's
wow, my
this.
favourite analogy.
I wish I could remember which episode that was. Maybe I can put it in the show notes. But potentially we're in this situation where basically we're saying, oh, thou shalt have an EDRMS, because we've gotten to this kind of weird vicious circle of thinking, well, that's what record keeping
Yeah,
compliance is, or records management compliance, apologies, is, that records management compliance is having a functioning EDRMS. But to me, I mean, so many recurrent themes in what we've been talking about we can weave back in here. Like again, it's the people, like having a system that no one is using, or having a technology that no one is using, means you still have a broken system. A good system must be, must include people and processes. It must include those routines. It must be the sum of how people are working and the tools they use to do the work well. So it can't, you can't just point at a technology and go, oh, well, look, the feature set and, functional spec.
But I
So,
mean, you got to look at how far behind the standards are. I mean,
mm,
Prov have only just released their business systems policy.
right. Yeah.
Which, and if you go and read it, it basically says that, you know, records in databases are records, and you got to keep them.
Hey.
I mean, it's like,
Well, that's
okay,
good. I
great,
mean, it's a good start.
yeah. It's, big paraphrase there, but that's basically what it says.
Yeah.
And how long have we had databases? And
Yeah.
how long have people been using business systems? And
Yeah.
I mean, could you? I keep looking at record systems, and you go and look in the bucket that's compliant with the standards that that the legislation and the archival regulation says that you have to use, and then you go and look at the business system that manages the business process, and I mean, which one of those is a better record? And I mean,
oh,
I would
yeah,
say every
absolutely.
single time, I want the business system,
Of
because I
course.
look at it
Yeah.
and it gives me all
Yep,
the information in the
yep.
context of its creation. I can understand where a process got to, where it went off the rails. I mean, it does then come down to how good is the record keeping in the organisation. Yeah,
I was I was always surprised at how much useful information seems to get lost on transfer to archives in the UK. I don't know if it's the same here. Well, of course, nobody's doing electronic transfer as far as I know,
Working on stuff. They're
um,
working on it. Yeah.
but yeah,
actually,
but
and Prov, to their credit, have said recently that they have taken a big transfer from one of the local universities, so they are taking electronic transfers.
right.
Yeah.
And maybe it's all changed, but certainly a few years ago, you might have all this lovely metadata in your line of business system, your EDRMS or whatever it is, but the spec for what needs to go to archives is so much less than that, and seemed to me to lose a lot of that lovely contextual. I know you're supposed to say, well, it belongs to this function and so on, but it seemed to throw away a lot of really useful subject based stuff, for example.
Interesting. Yeah. I think in New Zealand, there's
Or not
certainly,
require. I don't want to say throw away, but not require.
right. I mean, in New
Well, you can't
Zealand,
throw it
there's
away
always a
because
transferring archivist who would look at this stuff and would try and make some calls about that. So, yeah, I know. I mean, when I worked there, like this is a decade ago as well, that we were talking about whether or not sort of the function of a digital government archive is to be like a meta EDRMS, so the EDRMS of EDRMSs,
Yeah,
which seemed kind of the flavour of the day back then. So there's
right.
definitely that idea that there could be these. I mean, you could just think of it like an archival. Sorry, I've lost the words for this, but basically a kind of different set of, basically a different taxonomy or a different schema surrounding each set of information, and that you somehow needed to integrate those. And that's always one of the challenges thinking about digital archiving, is that
Mm.
the extent to which you want to try and pull together how things made sense in their context and not lose that is an open question. It's like, yeah, perhaps in the UK they went, right, that's just not sustainable. We're not going to be able to.
Well, it was quite a while ago, and I know there's been a lot more sophisticated work around thinking about using ontologies and so on to aid the storage and discovery of content.
I think something that we have to be clear about, though, too, is that there is the regulatory framework in the UK and Australia and New Zealand is quite different, though, too.
Sure.
And probably have to ask your colleagues about this, but my understanding is that in the UK there's no equivalent piece of legislation that basically says that any piece of information created by a public servant's a record and must be kept. There's nothing that says that, from what I understand. The other thing, and I could be wrong about that. Definitely not a specialist on UK legislation. The other thing that I understand, though, too, is that the archives have the archive has no power to regulate. So they are not a regulator in the UK. They are a cultural institution, and
That's
the way they actually capture records is that essentially they have historians and archivists who go out to the departments and talk to people there about significant events that have happened and capturing the records of those significant events. So it's very much my understanding is it's very much a pull system rather than the archive they're trying to regulate. And I think I think I'm on record as saying that I think one of the biggest problems that we've got with the regulatory framework in Australia and New Zealand is that it overreaches. It's the archive wants the whatever the percentage is, this tiny little percentage of records, and so they say, well, you can't delete anything ever. And I think there's a huge amount of overreach there.
I mean,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think both in Australia and New Zealand there are grounds for deleting a whole lot of stuff, but I just think that people get very nervous about doing that. Yeah,
Which is
I
good.
think. Sure.
I think that's good. I think it's appropriate. I
Yeah.
definitely don't want anyone to think that I think it's a good idea that public servants should be going around deleting stuff. That is
Occasionally
definitely
chucking stuff.
not.
That's
That's
definitely
definitely not
not a
what I
good
think.
idea.
But I think.
But I do think that the agency that the public servant works for carries the risk of the public servant doing that, and the minister that public servant works for carries the risk of that public servant doing that. And I think it's just something it's a constant topic of conversation with lots of people who are developing disposition schedules for government agencies. They'll go to the archive. Depending on the regulatory jurisdiction, there's generally an approval process in place where the archive has to bless your disposition schedule and say that yes, go forth and retain and dispose of things.
Yeah.
But the constant arguing with archives about well, we've got all the permanent classes over here. Okay, great. We've agreed. These are the things that should be permanently retained. These are the business activities that need permanent retention. But then the archives will argue with them over, well, you've called that 10 years retention. We think it should be 12, or you've called that 8 years retention, and we think it should be 6. And nobody can figure out why anybody at any of the archives is getting involved in that stuff, because it's not permanent retention. The archive has absolutely nothing to, no horse in that race. The agency actually carries the risk that record will be unable to be found when it's needed. And it's just a weird set of patterns that I keep seeing, but the complaints are really consistent, and I haven't been able to figure out why the archives are getting involved in that stuff. because they have no risk. They're not interested in, depending on the jurisdiction, not interested in anything until 15 years after it's created. So
I would have also thought that that they won't be as close to the. I mean, an appraisal archivist is not going to know as much as the person who wrote that that legal authority in consultation with a whole lot of people in the organisation who presumably would say, oh, specialist legislation that applies only to us says X, and our business context demands Y. Why would an archive think that? I mean, yeah, that they would know better, I guess. I mean, and I suppose, that sounds a bit judgy. I suppose, the flip side is that they would see a lot of sort of broader patterns across government, but still, it's just like, what's the benefit versus the amount of sort of time lost talking about those things or arguing over those things? Yeah. Um, I was thinking, just to take us on a slightly different track, but also to kind of wind it back a bit, talking about um, what you can and can't destroy has me thinking about the broader challenges of digital disposition and destruction in particular. I think one of the things that I've been trying to say about Microsoft 365 is that you can apply retention rules that either prevent destruction or actually set up auto delete rules um, across a massive breadth of information sources, I suppose. And so, for example, you can apply rules to OneDrives, or you can apply rules, which is like personal storage. You can apply rules to mailboxes. You can apply rules to, yes, any kind of a SharePoint site. You can apply rules to Teams chats. Um, and so I'm seeing interesting things happening there where people are suddenly going, oh, right. One of the weird phenomena of digital is that we've got absolute crap all over the place, and that's what people refer to as rot. Which um, I guess in a paper paradigm, we were very selective about what was actually the record and how we were going to manage that thing, and we did that through a sort of curatorial process. And it may or may not have worked. It may or may not have achieved outcomes that we wanted. I don't know, but
I think there's a point worth
sorry,
making
Karl.
there, and sorry to just jump in quickly, but the point is the economics have changed.
Mm-hmm.
If
Oh,
you're
yeah.
recording things on paper, I'm sitting here writing things, I handwrite at about, 25 words a minute, and I type at about 200 words a minute. And then, if I want to duplicate that piece of thing that I've just handwritten, well, that takes a long time. I'm not sure it was, I think it was selective. I think we were selective, but I think we were selective because the medium of recording was very expensive, time
Yeah,
cost,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
stuff cost.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fair point, but I also do think
And
I might have said this one before. I can't remember, sorry, but I think we have shifted to a bunch of the stuff that would have just been chat, as in colleagues sitting next to each other talking about how do I do X or whatever, has
yeah,
become recorded. So,
yeah, definitely
like in
true.
particular with remote working, a
Yeah,
certain pandemic and so on, you know,
yeah.
huge amount is like, we're having a laugh about X or Y, and that is recorded, and people get anxious about,
And is a record and therefore must be kept.
but
Yeah,
is it?
it's can
But,
record versus should record.
But
you
how do you weed that stuff out? Because
mm,
you've got, as you say, you've got the chat, and then you've got the important document or
so,
decision or
yeah,
something, approval, and then you've
absolutely.
got a load more, stuff about whatever, your
And
holiday.
I think like
Very hard,
yeah,
very
for
hard.
sure. And the classic kind of recordsy answer to that is, like if we were sitting around having a chat in a room, or like we are now, having a conversation about something, we made a decision. We ought to make a record of the decision, but we don't need to keep everything, or we don't. If you're essentially creating a file note or you're minuting something, we know that minutes are never full, in the sense that, a minute never covers off the bit where we chat at the start about, what we had for breakfast or whatever. And so in theory, you say, look, take it into the Microsoft realm again. If you're using Teams chats or you're using Skype chat or whatever, you identify a point at which, as a record keeper, you ought to keep a record. You go and create a record somewhere else. Like, that is the traditional answer to it. And I'm still leaning towards there's something good in that. Like, it does still make sense to me that a person, as part of good business practice, ought to identify that. But I think where I just come back over and over and over to, like, that's only going to happen when it's of value to that person. Like, it's only going to happen when so the person keeping the record is only going to keep the record when it's good for them too, or when they see good in doing that for their colleagues. The kind of.
But then they've got to see that good. I mean, for themselves, okay, right, but to see that good for their colleagues, they might not necessarily do that, or they might do it but go, "Oh, I can't be bothered."
Yeah, for sure, and they do.
It's
and that's what we all do, all of us.
Yeah, well, yes, that is what we all do. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a legal thing. I mean, I think this is ultimately, a lot of this stuff's going to be decided, based on case law.
Right.
And, I mean, I talk to people all the time, decisions being made in Teams chats, is, or authorized in Teams chats, is every second agency's thing that they're concerned about at the moment, at least the, agencies that I'm talking to. But I think ultimately a lot of this stuff's going to come down to what the courts think. I can't help but think that, are we going to have an expected standard in the future that decisions are recorded, because so much stuff is being in chat? Well, come on, where's the chat? You guys surely didn't have a phone call to discuss this stuff. And if you did have a phone call, you probably did it because you didn't want to create a record of it. So, where's your chat confirming that this decision was had? That was a really long-winded way to get to that point.
It would be easy enough to, replicate that and fake it and all the rest of it. So that won't be a proper record either.
Hashtag metadata. Well, I mean, maybe this is the thing. I mean, I'm putting together, Michael and I are presenting on a RIMPA thing in a couple of days' time about Microsoft 365, and I'm putting together I've taken one for the team and said, right, I'm going to do the non-compliance section of the event. And, I mean, there's a couple of things like, Microsoft 365 overwrites access metadata, after a specific period of time, depends on your licensing. Well, I mean, is that where EDRMS, starts to shine? Because it doesn't override it ever. I mean, sure, you do things like, tail logs off to a SIEM platform or something like that. But I mean, is that where we start to really see the value of this? I mean, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And this is one of the things that the constant optimizing problem type questions that bounce around in my head. It's, how is the standard of evidence changing based on the technology? And, I mean, are we pulling ourselves up to, where EDRMS is? Because I think you can make an argument that a large portion of the reason that EDRMS failed, and I don't know whether I said it this clearly, in the EDRMS episode, is because the standard is too high, and it's, there's the Cynefin model, of complex systems, and you look at the different domains in it, the simple and the complicated and the complex, and the names have changed. So I may be talking old names, but 3 of the domains, and basically what it says is that when you've got a simple problem that you're working with, that's the domain for best practice. As soon as you get out of the simple domain, best practice breaks because it's too rigid for the real world. And I mean, you could make an argument that, so much of what public servants do and so much of what government agencies do, exists in the complicated domain. You need real expertise to be able to do that thing. And so this very simple idea that we have just doesn't, which is what the standard is ultimately. It's a set of ideas that we're trying to make explicit and simple enough for ordinary people to carry them out. I mean, we could argue about that for ages. But I feel like there's a couple of points in there, ultimately, but one of them is that I think EDRMS sets a really high standard, and I think one of the problems is the standard is too high most of the time. Does that mean it's going to be too high into the future? There are lots of systems that, we're starting to see popping up that, connect to everything, capture everything, these Big Brother-esque type things that, are going to make keeping everything at that standard of EDRMS possible. So is what we're talking about just a gap in the technology where we've set this standard and it's taken a really long time to get to the point where we have technology that can realize it? And I don't know about that. And is there a benefit to that? And is ultimately that going to set the standard of record keeping?
Many things I could say here, but one of the ones that came to my mind when you're talking, Karl, was that
Just be quiet. You're talking rubbish.
Just shut your mouth. No, it was not that. Was about times when you do want to destroy information. Basically, there will be times when it's actually there is, if we're talking about public sector, there is public good in disposing of stuff. There's public good in chucking out. For instance, sensitive information about individuals that could be used against them. There's, I worked with a Dutch guy who would forever refer back to how basically what we would now call ethnicity data captured um, in come on, brain, jeez, in Amsterdam was then used by the Nazis to identify those who they wanted to kill. It was as simple as that. And the kind of that whole thing about, collecting data about individuals and letting the state accrue all of that stuff is, I think there's massive risks associated with that. But
I agree.
There are all these economics around all of this, which I think it will be really interesting. And I think your overall point about what will the courts say? One of the things I find very interesting, if I tie all this back to do we want to dispose of Teams chats, for instance? Several government departments in New Zealand are applying auto delete rules that just destroy your Teams chat. Say it's 30 days out, you just lose your chat. And they would do that to discourage the idea that this is where your significant records ought to be, and to try and drive a route, create a routine where you do capture decisions somewhere else. This is just for chat. But where I see other government departments pushing back against that, it's not to do with sort of records in the sense, it's to do with a kind of legal compliance thing. For instance, an employer bullying, a manager bullying their staff, things like that, and that records of those kinds of activities, of wrongdoing, of insider risk stuff, those it's that kind of an angle, and it's very a legalistic angle, and what I sort of generalize out of all of that is that there are these competing interests in terms of keeping or destroying stuff. One's about sort of business efficiency, one's about privacy, one's about a sort of a heritage view of the country, and about keeping government to account, which could be different again. And then there's this other one that's to do with basically being able to prosecute people, or being able to hold individuals to account for things they're not doing well, as opposed to hold the government to account. Yeah, so there's all these
That was
competing
just
things.
an excellent summary of the reasons for record keeping.
But I think I agree, but I think I think one of the things that we've got to be careful of there, though, too, is that, and this is where I keep coming back to the, we're trying to spend $10 to solve a 10-cent problem. The number of I keep talking to different agencies about disposing of electronic records, and I've never ever had a convincing business case made to me for the just general routine destruction of electronic records. It is so cheap to keep them that the process you've got to go through to actually destroy a record is so much more expensive than, I worked out the numbers, and at one point I was looking at keeping these things, and it was going to be 237,000 years worth of storage for the price that it was going to cost to dispose of this record. And like, those economics have to change. But I think the problem with that is that by trying to make disposition the $10 problem, we're not focusing on the $100 and the $1,000 problems. And I think that's what you're talking about, Michael. I think the stuff that you're talking about, that's the $100 problem, the $1,000 problem, the $10,000 problem. how do we make sure that how do we make sure managers aren't bullying their staff and give ourselves the ability to prosecute them when they are? Well, if that stuff's showing up in Teams chats, let's not get the records team focusing on implementing good retention and disposition practices. Let's get the records management team going, right, we have a risk here. This is the information that precedes that precedes that risk and proceeds from it. So let's get the information management team working on identifying that stuff when it happens.
Yeah,
We've got
let's get
personally
them.
identifiable information here. Let's not get them trying to manage every bit of information the agency creates uniformly. We know that this personally identifiable information leads to these specific types of risk. So let's get them focused on managing that. And you know what? Thinking about, let's destroy this stuff in 1,000 years' time when we know it's, we'll roll it off the end of the truck.
And that's getting increasingly easy to do. It's not easy, but getting easier to do, to identify, for example, personally identifiable information. As we know, there are tools being developed that allow you to do that, to do all kinds of analysis across different kinds of content. So I think, let's put the money there so that we can do that as far as we can, that automatic identification of those tricky, sensitive areas.
Yeah, where the category, can tell us a lot. And I mean, that is, I've got a presentation that I put forward for RIMPA this year, where the RIMPA conference that has been accepted, I will be presenting it. And what I'm arguing is that what we're seeing
Don't
at the
spoil
moment
it.
is the emergence of spoiler alert. So, if you really want to hear, but the thing I'm arguing for is that we've got a third generation of record systems emerging. And, it's the registry tied to the classifier. And what
Right,
that's
and I agree
ultimately
with
allowed.
that.
Yeah, and I think that's what you're
Yeah.
talking to, because what
Yeah,
it
it is.
allows us to see is it allows us
Absolutely.
to understand the
Yep.
category of
Yep.
information that's being
Yep.
created,
Yep.
so that we can understand the specific risks and how we're supposed to manage it. And
Yeah.
it's a level of abstraction away from the information itself. But we don't, as managers, we don't want to work with the information. We want to work with the abstraction. If we can get from the information to a set of, categories that the information falls into that tell us what we
Yeah.
need to do, then, that's the whole point of classification. And,
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a lot of good initiatives around that at the moment. This is where the kind of stuff that I really care about comes
and
into
some of the projects
play.
you've worked on,
And and I'm working on.
I may talk about some of those without telling people anything else.
I would
But we could talk about that, actually.
just emphasize for those out there listening that when we're talking about classification, we're meaning it in that broadest sense, like
Oh
classifying
yeah,
on any
categorization.
basis.
Yeah.
As in, putting things into
Into
categories. We're not talking
categories.
about,
Yeah.
yeah.
Not
And
not
the category doesn't just mean retention category. The category
no,
means risk
Yeah.
and.
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
nor does it mean necessarily putting like protective markings like security classifications, which is the other thing that I
No.
think people hear the word classification and think of that. But I think I wonder whether part of the future of information and records will be having that broader view of basically of classification in the sense of putting stuff into a category with regards to a business outcome that you expect to happen. So, so some kind of a risk you might be
Yeah.
managing or some flag of value
I think
in
absolutely,
that really
certainly.
broad sense, almost like a sort of an aggregator of classification systems. So it could be to do with security, could be to do with retention and disposal, could be, I don't know what else,
Or all kinds of stuff
privacy.
like sentiment analysis and all that,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
How many complaints are we getting in about
Right. Yep.
about this topic? Yeah.
We are. We are seeing that coming out in Microsoft 365 too, right? We've got sensitivity labels and we've got retention labels, and they are differentiated quite clearly as being two different things. And then, we've got tags as well, the ability to put things into other kinds of categories. So, and I guess that's nothing new, is it? It's just interesting that they're
There's also,
explicit.
It's nothing new. It's just the way that we approach it and the
yeah.
tools that we create in order to support that's new.
That's right, and lurking in the background as well as those other tools. So there's sensitive information types. So these things like, for instance, capturing your tax file number or IRD number, or
Yeah.
whatever, some kind of health number, identifying those things and raising those up so that you can then either trigger automated events off those, or you could just report on those. So I think records and information teams might get more into that. And you can do that through, machine learning type training, which
there's lots of ways. Yeah.
haven't heard positive outcomes in terms of the 365 ones there, but that's where Syntax, which is, relatively new technology, where that's supposed to come into play. To me, it just seems really exciting that, there will be all these opportunities to basically kind of think that broadly about how we're managing information. And I kind of think that's where the future is not being so focused on just R&D, basically just on retention and disposal. Yeah.
I mean, the point is that we're
time.
going to have, we've got machines that can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
Machines and the semantics that feed into the machines.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, that's the thing that I'm seeing. That the successful models that I'm seeing, they are the semantic models.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's just so much more power there too. I mean, using that stuff to do nothing but retention and disposition, to me, is kind of like it's the sledgehammer to crack a walnut analogy. If that's all you're doing with it, I mean.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, agreed.
So I mean, again, it's $10 solution for 10-cent problem, right? Let's just look, just retaining all your information actually doesn't cost the organisation in terms of risks and impacts. May as well.
You were going to wind us up, Michael.
And I'm going to wind you up. Yeah. We've been all over the show with this, but I guess there's some themes in there around how disposal and disposition even works, whether it's the thing you're trying to focus on, and a little bit more there on some of the specifics in 365. I guess, I mean, one thing I could just chuck in there in terms of thinking about the economics of these things is, I think I've said this before, but in New Zealand, the largest possible single fine that our regulator could apply is $10,000. And I think in 2023 money, if you think what's the cost of regulatory compliance versus a fine of $10,000, I mean, it just seems absolutely silly to me, to be blunt. Like the economics do not stack up whatsoever. Because how much, how much improvement could you get in your organisation for $10,000? It's like, right. On that glorious note, thank you very much, Karl and Judi, and we will catch you all again next time. Cheers.
Okay, see you.